My name is Amelia Martinez. I'm 32 years old, and I need to tell you about the day my brother ruined my wedding, then demanded $2,000 from me, and called me a liar when I said no. I know that sounds absolutely insane, and trust me, living through it was even worse than it sounds right now. This isn't just about a family argument or a little drama at a wedding reception. This is about betrayal, manipulation, and the moment I realized that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. You're probably thinking, how could a brother do something like that on his sister's wedding day? Well, buckle up, because what happened to me is something I never saw coming, and it changed everything about how I view family, loyalty, and what it really means to stand up for yourself. If you've ever felt trapped by family expectations or manipulated by someone you loved, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what I'm about to share might just help you see your own situation more clearly. Have you ever had someone close to you completely betray your trust on the most important day of your life? Picture this. You've spent months planning the perfect wedding, every detail carefully chosen, every moment imagined 1,000 times in your head. The dress, the flowers, the venue by the lake with those string lights that look like stars. Everything was supposed to be magical. I had dreamed about my wedding day since I was a little girl, and finally, at 32, I was marrying the love of my life, Daniel. My heart was so full of joy and excitement that I could barely sleep the night before. But somewhere in the back of my mind, there was this tiny voice of worry, this little whisper that said, "What about Marcus?" Marcus is my younger brother. He's 28, and if I'm being completely honest, he's always been difficult. Growing up, Marcus was the kind of kid who would break something and somehow convince our parents it was my fault. He had this talent for twisting situations, for making himself the victim, even when he was clearly the one causing problems. Our parents always made excuses for him. He's just going through a phase, or he's sensitive. You need to be more understanding. So I learned early on to keep the peace, to let things slide, to be the responsible older sister who didn't make waves. Even as adults, that pattern continued, and I kept hoping that one day Marcus would grow up and things would change. But here's the thing about hope. Sometimes it blinds you to reality. I invited Marcus to my wedding despite my fiancé Daniel suggesting maybe we shouldn't, given Marcus's history of causing drama at family events. Daniel had witnessed enough holiday dinners turned into shouting matches to be rightfully concerned. But I couldn't imagine getting married without my brother there. We're family, right? Blood is supposed to mean something. So I pushed aside Daniel's concerns, pushed aside my own doubts, and sent Marcus that invitation with a handwritten note telling him how much it would mean to me if he was there. Looking back now, I can see that I was setting myself up for heartbreak. But in that moment, all I wanted was for my family to be complete on the most important day of my life. The morning of the wedding arrived, and everything seemed perfect at first. The sun was shining, my bridesmaids were laughing as we got ready, and I felt like I was floating on air. My wedding dress fit like a dream, my makeup artist had made me look like the best version of myself, and when I looked in the mirror, I actually teared up because I felt beautiful. For those first few hours, I let myself believe that everything was going to be okay, that Marcus would be on his best behavior, that this day would be untouched by drama or conflict. But you know what they say about the calm before the storm? Sometimes the universe gives you this perfect moment of peace right before everything falls apart, and you don't even see it coming until it's too late. And that's exactly what happened to me that day. But what Marcus did next was something I could never have prepared for. Before I tell you what Marcus did at my wedding, I need you to understand something deeper about family dynamics and emotional manipulation. This story isn't just about one bad day or one terrible person. It's about patterns that develop over years, sometimes decades, where certain family members learn they can get away with anything because everyone else is too afraid of conflict to stop them. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew someone was treating you badly, but you felt obligated to accept it because they're family? That's the trap I was caught in, and I didn't even realize it until everything exploded on my wedding day. If this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button, because understanding these patterns is the first step to breaking free from them. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever felt like you had to sacrifice your own happiness to keep peace in your family? Growing up in a Latino family, I was taught that family comes first, always, and no matter what. My mom would say, "La familia es todo." Family is everything, and that message was drilled into me from the time I could understand words. Don't get me wrong, I love my culture, and I love the emphasis on family loyalty and support. But there's a dark side to that value when it's taken too far, when family first becomes an excuse for tolerating toxic behavior and abuse. I watched my parents make endless sacrifices for Marcus, bailing him out of financial troubles, making excuses when he'd disappear for weeks without calling, pretending everything was fine when he'd show up high to Christmas dinner. And every time I tried to talk about how his behavior was affecting everyone, I was told I was being selfish, that I didn't understand what he was going through, that a good sister would be more supportive. The truth is, I had been conditioned my entire life to put Marcus's needs above my own. When I got a scholarship to college, my parents asked me to defer for a year because Marcus was struggling, and they needed to focus on him. When I landed my dream job in another city, my mom cried and made me feel guilty for abandoning the family when Marcus needed us. Every milestone in my life was somehow overshadowed by whatever crisis Marcus was creating at the moment. And I accepted it because I thought that's what love looked like. That's what being a good daughter and sister meant. But love isn't supposed to hurt this much, and being family doesn't give someone the right to constantly sabotage your happiness. By the time I met Daniel 3 years before the wedding, I was exhausted from carrying the weight of my family's dysfunction. Daniel was the first person who ever told me that it wasn't normal, that I deserved better, that setting boundaries with family wasn't selfish, it was necessary. He would hold me while I cried after another phone call with Marcus demanding money, or my mom guilting me for not visiting enough. Daniel helped me see that I had been living my life in service to other people's chaos, never allowing myself to truly be happy, because I felt like I didn't deserve it if Marcus wasn't okay. Meeting Daniel was like waking up from a long, exhausting dream, and for the first time, I started to imagine a life where I could put my own needs first, where my happiness mattered just as much as anyone else's. But here's what I didn't understand then, what I wish someone had told me years ago. When you start setting boundaries with people who are used to having none, they fight back. They don't just accept your newfound strength and say, okay, I respect that. No, they push harder. They test those boundaries. They try to prove that you're still the same person who will cave under pressure. And my wedding day became Marcus's testing ground. The moment he decided to show me, and everyone else, that I couldn't escape the role I'd always played in our family. What he did wasn't just about ruining one day. It was about punishing me for daring to choose my own happiness over his needs. And the worst part? He almost succeeded in breaking me all over again. But the way everything unfolded was something straight out of a nightmare. Let me take you back to the months before the wedding, because you need to understand just how much this day meant to me to really grasp the devastation of what Marcus did. Planning a wedding is stressful for anyone, but for me, it was more than just planning an event. It was my chance to finally have something that was completely mine, untouched by family drama or Marcus's chaos. Every decision I made, from the color of the napkins to the song for our first dance, was deliberate and meaningful. I remember sitting with Daniel at our kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by fabric samples and flower catalogs, and feeling this overwhelming sense of peace, because for once, I was building something beautiful that had nothing to do with fixing someone else's mess. If you've ever poured your heart into something only to have someone destroy it, you know exactly how I felt. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to share will show you how dreams can turn into nightmares in a single moment. And I want to know, have you ever had someone deliberately ruin something precious to you? Daniel and I chose a venue by Lake Mendocino, because that's where he proposed to me on a cool October evening under a sky full of stars. The venue had this rustic barn that had been converted into an elegant reception hall, with exposed wooden beams and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. I must have visited that place a dozen times during the planning process, each time imagining how it would look filled with our family and friends, how the sunset would paint everything golden during our ceremony. We decided on a color scheme of deep burgundy and gold, autumn colors that felt warm and romantic. My dress was ivory lace with delicate beading on the bodice, something I'd found after trying on what felt like 100 dresses, and the moment I put it on, I knew it was the one. Every detail of that wedding was infused with meaning and love. Daniel and I wrote our own vows, spending weeks trying to put into words what we meant to each other. We chose readings that spoke about partnership and choosing to love someone every day, not just when it's easy. Our first dance song was At Last by Etta James because that's exactly how I felt when I met Daniel. Like I'd been waiting my whole life for someone who truly saw me and loved me for who I am, not who they needed me to be. Even our menu was carefully selected, with options that honored both of our families' cultures. My abuela's recipe for tamales as appetizers, and Daniel's grandmother's Irish soda bread. This wasn't just a party, it was a celebration of two people choosing to build a life together. And I wanted every guest to feel the love and intention we'd put into every single moment. The week before the wedding, I barely slept because I was so excited and nervous and overwhelmed with emotion. My bridesmaids, my best friend Sarah, my cousin Elena, and Daniel's sister Rebecca threw me a bachelorette party that was perfect and low-key, just dinner and dancing and laughing until our stomachs hurt. Sarah gave a toast that night that made me cry, talking about how she'd watched me transform from someone who always put herself last to someone who was finally claiming her own happiness. I remember thinking in that moment that I was the luckiest woman alive, that I'd somehow made it through all the hard years and come out the other side ready to start this beautiful new chapter. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5 a.m. with butterflies in my stomach, and I just laid there smiling at the ceiling, thinking, this is it. This is my day. Nothing can ruin this. But here's what I've learned about life. The universe doesn't care how much you've suffered or how much you deserve a perfect day. Sometimes terrible things happen on what should be the best days of your life, not because you did anything wrong, but because other people's brokenness spills over onto you no matter how hard you try to protect yourself from it. As I was getting ready that morning, having my hair curled and my makeup applied, laughing with my bridesmaids and sipping champagne, Marcus was already setting the stage for disaster. I didn't know it yet, but he'd shown up to the venue 3 hours early, already drunk, already angry about something I couldn't have possibly predicted. While I was feeling beautiful and loved and hopeful, he was out there poisoning the atmosphere, and the collision between my joy and his toxicity was about to create an explosion that would echo through my family for years to come. But what triggered him that day was something that still makes my blood boil. Now I need to be honest with you about Marcus and his history, because what happened at my wedding wasn't a random outburst. It was the culmination of 28 years of selfish, manipulative behavior that everyone in our family had enabled. Marcus had always been the center of attention, but not in a charming way, in a destructive, energy-sucking way that left everyone around him exhausted. Growing up, if Marcus didn't get what he wanted, he'd throw tantrums that would last for hours, sometimes days. As an adult, those tantrums evolved into more sophisticated forms of manipulation. Silent treatments, guilt trips, showing up at family events just to start arguments and then playing the victim when people got upset. I'd spent 3 decades walking on eggshells around him, and honestly, I thought maybe the wedding would be different. Maybe seeing me happy would make him want to be better. If you've ever dealt with a family member who makes everything about them no matter what's happening, you know how draining and heartbreaking it is. Subscribe and like this video, because what I'm sharing might help you recognize these patterns in your own life. And tell me in the comments, how do you deal with someone who refuses to let anyone else have their moment? The thing about Marcus is that he couldn't stand seeing other people happy, especially me. I don't say that to be mean. It's just the truth I finally accepted after years of making excuses for him. When I graduated valedictorian from high school, Marcus accidentally got arrested for shoplifting the night before my graduation ceremony, so instead of celebrating my achievement, my parents spent the whole day dealing with his mess. When I got engaged to Daniel, Marcus called me crying about how he'd just broken up with his girlfriend and couldn't bear to hear about my happiness when he was suffering. Every single milestone I'd ever had was overshadowed by some crisis Marcus created. And for the longest time, I thought it was just bad timing, just coincidence. But Daniel helped me see the pattern. Marcus sabotaged my joy because he couldn't handle not being the focus of everyone's attention and concern. In the months leading up to the wedding, Marcus had been relatively quiet, which should have been my first warning sign. He'd called me a few times asking about the details, who was invited, what the seating arrangement was, whether he could bring a +1 even though he wasn't dating anyone. I was so busy with wedding planning that I didn't pick up on the edge in his voice, the way he seemed overly interested in details that shouldn't have mattered to him. My mom had mentioned that Marcus seemed off lately, that he'd been fired from another job and was struggling to pay his rent. She'd hinted that maybe Daniel and I could help him out, maybe give him some money as a loan that we all knew would never be repaid. I'd said no for the first time in my life, told her that we were saving for our wedding and our future, and that Marcus needed to figure things out on his own. I could hear the disappointment in her voice, but I held firm, and I was proud of myself for setting that boundary. What I didn't know was that my refusal to bail Marcus out yet again had enraged him. He'd apparently told our entire extended family that I was being selfish and cold, that I was abandoning him in his time of need just because I wanted a fancy wedding. He'd twisted the narrative to make himself look like the victim and me like the villain, which was his specialty. Several relatives had called me in the weeks before the wedding, gently suggesting that maybe I should help Marcus out. That family was more important than a party. Each call felt like a knife in my heart because these were people I loved, people I respected, and they were all believing Marcus's lies without even asking for my side of the story. But I stood my ground because Daniel reminded me every day that I was doing the right thing, that enabling Marcus's behavior wasn't helping him. It was hurting him and everyone around him. The morning of my wedding, Marcus showed up early and already intoxicated, which I found out later from my cousin who'd arrived to help set up. He'd apparently cornered several family members, ranting about how I thought I was better than everyone, how I'd turned my back on the family, how this whole wedding was just me showing off. My aunt tried to calm him down, offered to make him coffee and get him some food, but he brushed her off and kept drinking from a flask he had in his jacket pocket. By the time the ceremony was supposed to start, Marcus was visibly drunk, stumbling around and making inappropriate comments to guests as they arrived. My wedding coordinator, bless her heart, tried to handle it discreetly, but there's only so much you can do with someone who's determined to cause a scene, and Marcus was on a mission to destroy my perfect day. And what he did during the ceremony itself was so shocking that half the guests gasped out loud. The ceremony was supposed to start at 4 p.m., right when the late afternoon sun would create that perfect golden light over the lake. I was in the bridal suite with my bridesmaids, completely oblivious to the chaos Marcus was creating outside, putting the final touches on my makeup and taking deep breaths to calm my nerves. My dad came to get me, and I could see something was wrong in his eyes, but he just smiled and said, "You look beautiful, mija." And I chose to believe that everything was fine. We walked toward the ceremony space arm in arm, and I could hear the string quartet playing, could see all our guests standing and turning to look at me, and my heart was so full I thought it might burst. But then I saw Daniel's face at the altar, and it wasn't the joyful expression I'd expected. It was concern mixed with anger, and that's when I knew something terrible had happened. If you've ever had a moment where you knew your life was about to change in the worst way possible, hit that subscribe button and like this video, because what I'm about to tell you is every bride's nightmare. Have you ever had someone you love intentionally humiliate you in front of everyone you care about? As I walked down the aisle, I noticed Marcus standing off to the side near the front row, swaying slightly, his tie loosened and his shirt partially untucked. My stomach dropped, but I kept smiling, kept walking, because what else could I do? I'd already committed to walking down that aisle, all eyes were on me, and turning around would have caused an even bigger scene. I reached Daniel, handed my bouquet to Sarah, and tried to focus on the officiant's words, but I could see Marcus out of the corner of my eye, muttering something to our cousin next to him. The ceremony had barely begun. We hadn't even gotten to the vows yet, when Marcus suddenly stood up and shouted, "This is bullshit!" The entire ceremony stopped. 150 guests turned to stare at him, and I felt my face go hot with humiliation and shock. Marcus stumbled forward, pointing at me with an unsteady hand, his words slurring together as he said, "You all think she's so perfect, don't you? Saint Amelia, getting married in her fancy dress at her fancy venue. But she's a selfish bitch who won't even help her own brother when he's struggling." I literally felt my knees go weak, and Daniel grabbed my hand so tight I thought my fingers might break. My dad rushed toward Marcus, trying to grab him and pull him away, but Marcus shoved him back and kept going. He told everyone that I'd refused to lend him money, that I'd turned my back on family, that I cared more about impressing people than helping the people who'd raised me. Every word felt like a slap across my face, and I just stood there frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, watching my dream day disintegrate in real time. The worst part wasn't even what Marcus said. It was watching my family's reactions. Some people looked horrified, but others looked at me with something like agreement, like maybe Marcus had a point. My mom was crying, but she wasn't rushing to defend me. She was crying for Marcus, worried about him making a scene. My uncle and 2 groomsmen finally managed to physically drag Marcus away from the ceremony space, and he was screaming the whole time, calling me names and saying things that I can't even repeat here. The officiant tried to continue the ceremony, suggested we take a moment and then proceed, but I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. Daniel whispered in my ear, "We don't have to do this right now. We can postpone, whatever you need." And I looked at him, and I looked at all our guests staring at me with pity and discomfort, and I made a decision that surprised even myself. I decided to continue with the ceremony because I refused to let Marcus take this away from me completely. My voice was shaking as I spoke my vows, tears streaming down my face, but I meant every word I said to Daniel in that moment. We got through the ceremony, and when the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause felt muted and awkward, nothing like the joyful celebration I'd imagined. As we walked back down the aisle as a married couple, I could see people whispering, could feel the weight of their judgment and curiosity, and instead of feeling like the happiest woman alive, I felt humiliated and angry and heartbroken. We went straight into the reception because what else could we do? The photographer tried to take our portraits by the lake, but I couldn't stop crying, and in every photo from that day, you can see the pain in my eyes. But Marcus wasn't done destroying my wedding. What he did during the reception was somehow even worse than interrupting the ceremony, and it involved that $2,000 that would become the breaking point of our entire relationship. After Marcus's outburst during the ceremony, my uncle and aunt had taken him to a back room in the venue to try to calm him down and sober him up. I honestly thought, or hoped, that they'd just take him home, that the nightmare would be over, and I could try to salvage what was left of my wedding reception. Daniel and I made our grand entrance into the reception hall, and people clapped and cheered, but it all felt hollow and forced, like everyone was pretending the last hour hadn't happened. I plastered on a smile and tried to enjoy the first dance, the toasts, the dinner, but my mind was spinning with humiliation and anger. Every time someone approached me to congratulate us, I wondered if they were judging me for what Marcus had said, if they believed his lies about me being selfish and cold. About an hour into the reception, I excused myself to go to the restroom, needing just 5 minutes alone to cry and pull myself together. And that's when Marcus cornered me in the hallway outside the bathrooms. If you've ever been blindsided by someone's audacity, someone's complete lack of shame after they've already hurt you, smash that like button and subscribe because you need to hear how bold some people can be. Tell me, has anyone ever wronged you and then had the nerve to ask you for something right after? Marcus was leaning against the wall, looking slightly more sober than he had during the ceremony, but his eyes were hard and cold in a way that made my skin crawl. He said, "Amelia, we need to talk," and I tried to walk past him, but he blocked my path. I told him he'd already said enough, that he'd ruined my wedding, and I didn't want to hear anything else from him, but he grabbed my arm, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop me. He said, "You owe me $2,000, and I need it tonight." I literally laughed in disbelief because the absurdity of the moment was too much to process. Here was my brother, who'd just humiliated me in front of everyone I loved, now demanding money from me at my own wedding reception, and he seemed to think this was completely reasonable. I asked him what he was talking about, and Marcus claimed that 6 months ago, he'd lent me $2,000 when I was supposedly short on rent. The thing is, that never happened, not even close. I'd never borrowed money from Marcus in my entire life. It had always been the other way around, with him constantly asking me and our parents for loans he never repaid. I told him he was lying, that I'd never taken a penny from him, and his face twisted into this ugly sneer as he said, "Oh, so now you're calling me a liar? Just like you've been lying to the family about why you won't help me?" He raised his voice, and I could see some guests in the reception hall starting to look toward us, could see my bridesmaids beginning to stand up, sensing something was wrong. Marcus kept insisting that I owed him this money, that he had proof, that he'd helped me when I needed it, and now I was refusing to return the favor. He said he needed the money immediately because he was about to be evicted from his apartment, that it was an emergency, that if I really loved him as a sister, I'd write him a check right now. The manipulation was so transparent, so textbook, that I almost couldn't believe it was happening. He was trying to gaslight me into believing something that never occurred, and when that didn't work, he was trying to guilt me with the family card again. I stood there in my wedding dress, mascara probably running down my face from earlier crying, and I felt something shift inside me, a hardness, a clarity I'd never felt before when dealing with Marcus. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, I'm not giving you any money, Marcus, because I don't owe you anything. I never borrowed money from you, and even if I had, demanding it from me on my wedding day after what you just did would be insane." His face turned red, and he started yelling again, calling me a liar, saying I'd always thought I was better than him, that I was heartless and cruel. Daniel appeared behind me. Sarah had gotten him, and he positioned himself between Marcus and me, telling Marcus he needed to leave immediately or Daniel would call the police. Marcus looked at both of us with this expression of pure hatred and said, "Fine, don't help me, but everyone's going to know what kind of person you really are, Amelia. Everyone's going to know you're a selfish liar who abandons family. And then he stormed out, slamming doors on his way, leaving me standing there shaking and wondering how my wedding day had turned into the worst day of my life. But the real fallout from that night was only just beginning, and the way my family reacted afterward hurt almost as much as what Marcus had done. After Marcus stormed out of the venue, Daniel and I returned to the reception, and I tried desperately to pretend everything was fine, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking and I couldn't focus on anything anyone was saying to me. The rest of the reception passed in a blur. I cut the cake without tasting it. I danced with my dad while crying on his shoulder, and I smiled for photos that I knew would forever remind me of the worst day of my life. When the night finally ended and Daniel and I got to our hotel room, I just collapsed on the bed still in my wedding dress and sobbed for what felt like hours. Daniel held me and kept saying it wasn't my fault, that Marcus was sick and toxic. But all I could think about was how I'd let this happen, how I'd invited him knowing deep down that he might do something like this. If you've ever felt responsible for someone else's terrible behavior because you didn't protect yourself well enough, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button, Because what I learned in the days after my wedding might save you from the same pain. Have you ever blamed yourself for not seeing a betrayal coming even when all the signs were there? The next morning, Daniel and I were supposed to leave for our honeymoon in Hawaii, 2 weeks on Maui that we'd been planning and saving for over a year. But I couldn't imagine getting on a plane and pretending to be happy when I felt so destroyed inside. I told Daniel I wanted to cancel the trip, that I couldn't enjoy a honeymoon after what had happened, but he gently convinced me that running away from our plans would be letting Marcus win again. He said, "Marcus has already stolen our wedding day. Don't let him steal our honeymoon too." And something about that phrasing hit me hard. Marcus had stolen so many things from me over the years, and I'd let him because I didn't know how to stop him. But this time, I could make a different choice. We went to Hawaii, and those 2 weeks became a strange mix of healing and processing trauma. During the day, we'd go to the beach or explore the island, and I'd have moments where I'd actually forget about the wedding disaster and just enjoy being with my new husband. But at night, I'd lie awake replaying everything that happened, hearing Marcus's voice calling me selfish and cruel, seeing the faces of family members who'd looked at me with judgment and disappointment. Daniel would wake up and find me crying, and we'd talk for hours about family dynamics, about boundaries, about what it means to love someone who hurts you repeatedly. Those conversations in that hotel room in Maui changed something fundamental in me. I started to see clearly for the first time how much of my life I'd sacrificed trying to manage Marcus's chaos. The internal conflict I was experiencing was overwhelming and exhausting. Part of me felt guilty. Maybe I should have helped Marcus with the money. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe family really should come first no matter what. But another part of me, a newer, stronger part that Daniel had helped cultivate, was angry and done with the guilt. That part of me kept asking, why should you set yourself on fire to keep Marcus warm? Why is his crisis always more important than your joy? When does it end? I spent hours journaling on the beach, trying to work through these conflicting feelings, trying to figure out who I wanted to be going forward. Did I want to be the Amelia who always gave in to keep the peace? Or did I want to be someone different? Someone who could say no without drowning in guilt? By the end of our honeymoon, I'd made a decision that terrified me but felt necessary for my survival. I was going to confront Marcus and set real boundaries, and I was going to do it regardless of how my family reacted. I couldn't keep living the way I'd been living, couldn't keep sacrificing my mental health and happiness for someone who clearly had no respect for me. Daniel supported me completely, even offered to be there when I confronted Marcus, but I knew this was something I needed to do myself. On the plane ride home, I practiced what I'd say, how I'd stay calm and firm, how I wouldn't let Marcus manipulate me into backing down. I felt scared but also strangely empowered, like I was finally taking control of my own life after years of letting other people dictate how I should feel and what I should do. But when I actually tried to have that conversation with Marcus, his response was so manipulative and vicious that it made the wedding incident look almost mild in comparison. 3 days after Daniel and I returned from our honeymoon, I called Marcus and asked him to meet me at a coffee shop to talk. I chose a public place because I didn't trust what might happen if we were alone, and I wanted witnesses if things got ugly. Marcus showed up 20 minutes late, which was typical for him, looking disheveled and angry like I'd inconvenienced him by asking for this meeting. I'd prepared myself mentally, had my talking points ready, had promised Daniel I wouldn't let Marcus derail me with guilt or manipulation, but the moment Marcus sat down and looked at me with those cold eyes, I felt my confidence start to waver. I took a deep breath and said, "We need to talk about what happened at my wedding and about the boundaries we need to set going forward." And before I could say anything else, Marcus cut me off and said, "You mean we need to talk about the $2,000 you owe me and why you're refusing to pay it back?" If you've ever tried to have a serious conversation with someone who twists every word and refuses to acknowledge reality, subscribe and like this video, because what I'm about to share shows exactly how manipulators operate. Tell me, how do you handle someone who gaslights you when you try to address their bad behavior? Marcus completely ignored everything about his behavior at the wedding, and instead launched into this elaborate story about how he'd supposedly lent me money last March when I was having trouble making rent. He had details, specific dates, specific amounts, even a story about how I'd called him crying and begging for help. The problem was that absolutely none of it was true, not a single word. Last March, I'd been living comfortably with Daniel. We'd had no financial problems whatsoever, and I certainly hadn't called Marcus for anything. But the way he told the story, with such conviction and specific details, I could see how someone who didn't know the truth might believe him. This is what Marcus did. He lied so convincingly that even I started questioning my own memory for a split second before reality kicked back in. I told him clearly and firmly that his story was completely fabricated, that I had bank statements and records proving I'd never needed or received money from him. Marcus's face turned red, and he raised his voice saying, "So now you're calling me a liar after everything I've done for you?" This is exactly what I told Mom and Dad. You've changed, Amelia. You've become cold and selfish since you met Daniel. He was trying to use my parents as leverage, trying to make me feel like everyone was against me and he was the reasonable one. He claimed that I was rewriting history to make myself look better, that I was ashamed to admit I'd needed help and now I was punishing him for being a good brother. The manipulation was so textbook, so obvious, but it still affected me because this was my brother, someone I'd loved my whole life, and hearing him lie so blatantly was heartbreaking. When I refused to back down, when I kept insisting that none of his story was true, Marcus shifted tactics and went for the emotional jugular. He started crying, actual tears, talking about how hard his life had been, how everyone in the family got support except him, how he'd always been there for me, and now I was abandoning him when he needed me most. He said, "I'm about to be homeless, Amelia. I'm losing my apartment, I have nowhere to go, and my own sister won't even help me with money she owes me. What kind of person does that make you?" He was performing, putting on a show, and I could see other coffee shop customers glancing over at us, probably thinking I was the bad guy in this situation. The humiliation and frustration I felt in that moment was suffocating. How do you defend yourself against lies that sound so convincing? I looked at Marcus, at his tears and his desperate expression, and I felt something inside me shut down, not in a bad way, but in a protective way, like a door closing on a room I'd been trapped in my whole life. I said quietly but firmly, "Marcus, you're lying. You know you're lying. I know you're lying, and I'm not going to engage with this fantasy you've created. You ruined my wedding, you tried to extort money from me, and now you're spreading lies to our family to make me look like the villain. I'm done. I'm not giving you money. I'm not apologizing for protecting myself, and I need you to stay away from me until you're ready to take real responsibility for your actions." Marcus stopped crying immediately. The tears just dried up like I'd flipped a switch, and he looked at me with pure hatred and said, "You're going to regret this. Everyone's going to know what a liar you are. I'll make sure of it." And then he walked out, leaving me sitting there realizing that this was war, and my family was about to become a battlefield. Within 24 hours of my coffee shop meeting with Marcus, my phone started blowing up with calls and texts from family members, and every single message had the same theme. I was being cruel to Marcus. I needed to help him. Family doesn't turn their back on family. My mom called me crying, saying Marcus had told her I was refusing to pay back money I owed him and that he was going to be homeless because of me. My aunt sent me a long text about how disappointed she was in me, how I'd become prideful and selfish since getting married. Even my cousin Elena, who'd been one of my bridesmaids, texted asking if there was any truth to what Marcus was saying and suggesting maybe I should just give him the money to keep the peace. I felt like I was going insane, like I'd stepped into an alternate reality where I was the villain in a story I knew wasn't true. If you've ever been ganged up on by your family for setting boundaries with a toxic person, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what happened next will show you exactly how family systems protect the abuser instead of the victim. Have you ever been made to feel like the bad guy for refusing to be someone's doormat? The isolation hit me like a physical blow because these were people I loved, people who'd known me my whole life, and they were choosing to believe Marcus's lies over my truth without even asking for my side of the story. My mom invited me to dinner at my parents' house, and I thought maybe it was a chance to explain everything, to tell them what really happened and get them to understand. But when I walked in, it was like an intervention. My mom, my dad, my uncle, and my aunt all sitting in the living room with serious expressions, and I knew immediately this wasn't going to be a supportive conversation. My dad, who usually stayed out of family drama, started by saying, "Amelia, we need to talk about your brother and this money situation." My heart sank, because even he had been convinced by Marcus's lies. I spent 2 hours at that dinner trying to explain that Marcus's story was completely fabricated, that I had bank records proving I'd never borrowed money from him, that he'd interrupted my wedding ceremony drunk, and then tried to extort money from me. But every time I spoke, I could see doubt in their eyes, like they wanted to believe me, but Marcus had already poisoned them against me. My mom kept saying, "Why would Marcus lie about something like this? He's your brother. He loves you." And I wanted to scream, "Because that's what he does. He's been lying and manipulating all of us for years." But I could see it was useless. They'd already decided I was the problem, that I'd changed, that my new husband had turned me against my family. The gaslighting was coming from all directions now, not just from Marcus, and I felt like I was drowning. The worst moment came when my dad said, "Even if what you're saying is true, even if Marcus is exaggerating or confused about the money, is it really worth tearing the family apart over $2,000? Can't you just help him and move on?" And that's when I realized they didn't care about the truth. They cared about maintaining the illusion of family harmony, even if it meant sacrificing me on the altar of Marcus's dysfunction. They wanted me to pay him money I didn't owe him, to let him get away with ruining my wedding, to continue being the scapegoat who absorbed all his chaos so everyone else could pretend everything was fine. I looked around that living room at people I'd trusted my whole life, and I felt something break inside me, not in a destructive way, but in a liberating way, like chains falling off. I stood up and said something I'd never had the courage to say before. "I'm not the one tearing this family apart. Marcus is, and all of you enabling his behavior, making excuses for him, asking me to sacrifice myself to keep him comfortable, you're helping him destroy himself and everyone around him. I love you all, but I will not set myself on fire to keep Marcus warm anymore. I don't owe him money. I won't give him money. And if that makes me the villain in this family, then I guess I'm the villain." My mom started crying. My dad looked angry, and my uncle tried to argue with me, but I just grabbed my purse and walked out. As I drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I called Daniel and told him what happened, and he said something that made me cry with relief. "I'm proud of you. You just chose yourself for the first time, and that takes incredible strength. But choosing myself meant losing my family, at least temporarily, and the grief of that loss was almost unbearable. I had to figure out how to build a life where protecting my peace was more important than keeping toxic people comfortable." The weeks after that family dinner were some of the darkest of my life because I was experiencing something I'd never felt before: complete alienation from my family of origin. My parents stopped calling me. My extended family members unfriended me on social media, and I heard through a mutual friend that Marcus was telling everyone I'd threatened him and was trying to turn the family against him. The narrative he'd created had taken on a life of its own, and I was powerless to stop it because the truth didn't matter. People believed what they wanted to believe, and they wanted to believe that I was the problem because that was easier than confronting Marcus's decades of toxic behavior. I'd wake up in the middle of the night crying, feeling like I'd been orphaned even though my parents were still alive. If you've ever had to choose between your mental health and your family's approval, make sure to subscribe and like this video, because what I learned about boundaries literally saved my life. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to cut off family members to protect yourself? Daniel suggested I start seeing a therapist to help me process everything that was happening, and that decision changed everything for me. My therapist, Dr. Chen, was the first person outside of Daniel who validated my experience and helped me see the family dynamics clearly. She explained something called the identified patient in family systems. Basically, one person gets scapegoated as the problem so everyone else can avoid looking at the real dysfunction. In my family, I'd become the identified patient, the troublemaker, because I'd stopped playing my assigned role of Marcus's caretaker and enabler. Dr. Chen helped me understand that setting boundaries wasn't selfish or cruel. It was necessary for survival, and healthy families respect boundaries while toxic families punish you for having them. Through therapy, I started to understand what boundaries actually meant, not just in theory but in practical application. A boundary isn't about controlling other people or punishing them. It's about deciding what you will and won't accept in your life and following through with consequences when those lines are crossed. I'd spent my whole life with no boundaries, letting Marcus and my family trample all over me, and now I needed to build them from scratch. Dr. Chen and I worked together to define clear boundaries. I would not engage with Marcus until he genuinely apologized and got professional help. I would not discuss Marcus or give him money even if family members pressured me. I would not attend family events where Marcus was present if I didn't feel safe, and I would not accept phone calls or texts from family members who wanted to guilt me or argue about my decisions. Setting those boundaries felt terrifying and liberating at the same time, like jumping off a cliff but discovering you could fly. The first time my mom called crying and begging me to just forgive Marcus and move on, I used the script Dr. Chen had helped me practice. "Mom, I love you, but I'm not willing to discuss Marcus with you. If you'd like to have a relationship with me that doesn't involve trying to fix things with Marcus, I'd love that. But if you keep bringing this up, I'll need to end the conversation." My mom was shocked. She'd never heard me speak to her that way, and she got angry, said I was being disrespectful and cold. But I stayed calm and said, "I'm going to hang up now. I hope we can talk another time about other things." And I actually hung up on my own mother, something I never would have imagined doing 6 months earlier. Each time I enforced a boundary, it got a little bit easier, and I started to notice something amazing. I felt lighter, less anxious, more like myself than I'd felt in years. I wasn't constantly waiting for the next Marcus crisis or the next family guilt trip. Daniel and I started building our own life, our own traditions, our own definition of family that wasn't based on obligation and dysfunction, but on mutual respect and genuine love. We had friends over for dinner parties. We took weekend trips. We talked about our dreams for the future without the dark cloud of family drama hanging over everything. I grieved the family I'd wanted, the loving, supportive family that put truth and health above maintaining appearances. But I celebrated the family I was creating with Daniel, and slowly, very slowly, I started to heal from decades of emotional damage. But the journey wasn't over yet, because Marcus wasn't done trying to punish me for escaping his control. About 4 months after my wedding disaster, something happened that tested every boundary I'd worked so hard to establish. Marcus showed up at my workplace unannounced, looking desperate and claiming he needed to talk to me urgently. My heart started racing the moment the receptionist called and said my brother was in the lobby asking for me, because I knew this was a deliberate violation of the space I'd created between us. I could have easily told the receptionist to send him away, to call security if he refused to leave, but there was still this tiny part of me, that old version of Amelia, that felt obligated to at least hear him out. I went down to the lobby, and Marcus immediately launched into another sob story about how dire his situation was, how he'd been evicted, how he had nowhere to go, and how he needed just $500 to get into a new place. The old me would have felt crushing guilt and probably written him a check right there, but the new me, the me who'd been working with Dr. Chen and building boundaries, felt something different. Clarity. If you've ever had to say no to someone you love even when it breaks your heart, subscribe and hit that like button because what I'm sharing could change how you handle manipulation forever. Have you ever felt guilty for protecting yourself from someone who kept hurting you? Standing in that lobby with Marcus looking at me with those pleading eyes, I felt the full weight of my decision to choose myself over family obligation. Every fiber of my being that had been conditioned since childhood was screaming at me to help him, to fix his problem, to be the good sister who didn't let family suffer. But I'd learned something crucial in therapy. Helping Marcus when he refused to help himself wasn't actually helping. It was enabling his destructive patterns and preventing him from hitting the rock bottom he needed to hit to change. So I took a deep breath and said the hardest word I'd ever spoken to a family member. No. Marcus's expression immediately shifted from desperate to angry, and he started raising his voice, saying I was heartless, that he couldn't believe his own sister would let him be homeless. I stayed calm, or at least appeared calm on the outside while my insides were churning, and I said something I'd practiced with Dr. Chen dozens of times. Marcus, I care about you, but I cannot give you money. I cannot fix your housing situation. What I can do is give you the number for some resources that help people in crisis, and I strongly encourage you to look into rehab and therapy because you need professional help that I cannot provide. Marcus looked at me like I'd slapped him, and he said, Resources? Therapy? I don't need therapy, Amelia. I need my sister to act like family. But I didn't budge. I pulled out a piece of paper I'd actually prepared weeks earlier, because Dr. Chen had predicted this exact scenario, with phone numbers for homeless services, addiction support, and mental health resources in our area. Marcus refused to take the paper, actually slapped it out of my hand so it fell to the floor, and started making a scene in my office lobby, calling me names and saying I'd regret abandoning him. My coworkers were staring. My boss had come out of his office to see what was happening, and I felt humiliation wash over me. But this time, I recognized it for what it was. Marcus trying to shame me into compliance by making me uncomfortable in front of people I worked with. I picked up the paper from the floor, held it out to him one more time, and when he refused again, I said clearly and firmly, I need you to leave now, Marcus. If you don't leave, I'll have to call security. He stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to decide if I was bluffing, and when he saw I was serious, he called me a word I won't repeat and stormed out of the building. I went to the bathroom and cried for 20 minutes, not because I regretted my decision, but because saying no to family, really truly saying no and meaning it, was one of the most painful things I'd ever done. But when I finally composed myself and went back to my desk, I felt something unexpected. Pride. I'd stood my ground, I'd enforced my boundary even when it was uncomfortable and scary, and I'd survived the guilt and shame Marcus had tried to weaponize against me. That night, Daniel took me out to dinner to celebrate what he called my graduation from people-pleasing school, and for the first time since the wedding, I actually laughed. A real, genuine laugh that came from deep in my belly. I was learning that saying no didn't make me a bad person. It made me a person who valued herself enough to stop accepting unacceptable behavior. But the aftermath of that confrontation would reveal just how far Marcus was willing to go to punish me for my newfound strength. Within hours of Marcus leaving my workplace, the family phone tree lit up like Christmas, except instead of joy, it was spreading poison. Marcus had called everyone, and I mean everyone, with his version of what happened, painting himself as a desperate man who'd humbled himself to ask his sister for basic help and been cruelly rejected in front of her coworkers. My phone started buzzing with angry texts and voicemails, each one more accusatory than the last, and I could see the same pattern playing out that had happened after the wedding. Marcus created chaos, and the family blamed me for not managing it better. My mom left a voicemail where she was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words, something about how could I let my brother be on the streets, how she didn't raise me to be so cold. My aunt sent a text saying I should be ashamed of myself, that family takes care of family no matter what. Even distant relatives I barely spoke to were suddenly weighing in with opinions about my character and my responsibilities. If you've ever been the scapegoat in a dysfunctional family system, make sure you're subscribed and give this video a like, because what I learned about family reactions to boundary setting might save you years of pain. Tell me, has your family ever turned on you for refusing to enable someone's bad behavior? The attacks weren't just coming through phone calls and texts. Marcus had taken to social media, posting vague but obviously pointed messages about how blood means nothing to some people, how success changes people and makes them forget where they came from. He never mentioned me by name, but he didn't have to. Our mutual friends and family members knew exactly who he was talking about. I watched as people I'd known my whole life liked his posts and left sympathetic comments, and each notification felt like a small betrayal. Some of Marcus's posts were outright lies. He claimed I'd promised to help him, and then backed out at the last minute, that I'd told him to his face that I didn't care if he ended up on the streets, that I'd laughed at his pain. None of it was true, but the lies spread faster than the truth ever could. What shocked me most wasn't Marcus's behavior. I'd come to expect manipulation and dishonesty from him, but how quickly and completely other family members joined his narrative without ever once reaching out to ask for my side of the story. My cousin Roberto, who I'd been close to growing up, sent me a long message about how disappointed he was in me, how family is supposed to stick together through hard times, how my refusal to help Marcus was going to have karmic consequences. When I tried to explain what had actually happened, how Marcus had lied about lending me money and had been manipulating everyone, Roberto's response was, "Even if that's true, he's still family and he still needs help." That phrase, "even if that's true," haunted me because it revealed the fundamental problem. The truth didn't matter to these people. They'd decided on a narrative that was comfortable for them, one where I was the villain and Marcus was the victim, and no amount of evidence or explanation was going to change their minds. The emotional toll of being treated like a pariah by my own family was enormous and devastating in ways I didn't expect. I started having panic attacks when my phone rang, afraid it would be another family member calling to berate me. I had nightmares about family gatherings where everyone pointed at me and called me heartless. Daniel found me crying in the shower one morning, and when he asked what was wrong, all I could say was, "They hate me. My whole family hates me." He held me and said, "They don't hate you. They're just uncomfortable with you not playing the role they assigned you, so they're trying to force you back into it. But you're stronger than that now." His words helped, but they didn't erase the grief I felt at losing my family, even though I knew intellectually that I was doing the right thing. The turning point came about 2 weeks after the workplace incident when my dad called, not to yell at me, but to talk, really talk, for the first time in months. He said, "Amelia, your mother and I have been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and we want to understand your perspective." I was so shocked I almost dropped the phone, because my dad had been one of the people most firmly in Marcus's corner. We met for coffee, just the two of us, and I brought bank statements, text message records, everything I had to prove that Marcus's story about lending me money was fabricated. My dad looked through everything carefully, and I watched his face change as he realized the extent of Marcus's lies. He didn't apologize right away. That would come later, but he said something that meant everything to me. "I think we've been enabling Marcus for a long time, and I think we've been unfair to you." It wasn't a complete vindication. It wasn't my whole family suddenly seeing the light, but it was a crack in the wall of denial. And through that crack, light was starting to come in, and that small moment of being seen and believed gave me the strength to keep moving forward with my new life. The conversation with my dad marked the beginning of a slow but significant shift in how I saw myself and my place in the world, because for the first time in my life, someone from my family had validated my reality, instead of gaslighting me into doubting it. In the months that followed, I noticed changes in myself that went far beyond just saying no to Marcus. I was becoming a fundamentally different person, someone who prioritized her own well-being and didn't apologize for it. I started speaking up in situations where I used to stay silent. I stopped over-explaining my decisions to people who hadn't earned that level of access to my inner life, and I learned to sit with the discomfort of people being disappointed in me without immediately trying to fix it. The old Amelia would have crumbled under the weight of family disapproval, but the new Amelia understood that their discomfort with my boundaries was not my responsibility to manage. If you're going through your own transformation and learning to put yourself first after years of people-pleasing, hit that subscribe button and like this video because what I'm sharing could accelerate your healing journey. Have you noticed changes in yourself after you started setting boundaries? And how did it feel to become someone new? My self-esteem, which had been buried under decades of criticism and manipulation, started to rebuild itself from the ground up like a house being constructed on a stronger foundation. I noticed it in small ways at first. I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. I accepted compliments without deflecting them. I made decisions based on what I wanted rather than what would make other people happy. Dr. Chen helped me understand that my people-pleasing tendencies had been a survival mechanism in a family where my worth was conditional on how well I managed everyone else's emotions. But now that I'd removed myself from that toxic system, I could learn to value myself intrinsically, not based on how useful I was to others. I started a gratitude journal where I wrote down 3 things I was proud of myself for each day, and at first it felt awkward and forced, but eventually it became natural to recognize my own strength and resilience. The process of healing wasn't linear. Some days I felt strong and confident, and other days I'd spiral into guilt and doubt, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake by standing up to my family. There were moments when I'd see a happy family photo on social media and feel this aching loneliness, this sense that I was broken and defective because I couldn't make my family work. But Daniel and Dr. Chen kept reminding me that I hadn't broken my family. It had been broken long before I stopped pretending it was fine. They reminded me that choosing myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary, and that the pain I was feeling was grief for the family I'd always wanted but never actually had. I learned to sit with that grief, to honor it without letting it pull me back into dysfunction, and slowly the bad days became less frequent and less intense. One of the most profound changes I experienced was in my relationship with Daniel and how I showed up in my marriage. Before the wedding disaster and the boundary setting that followed, I'd brought all my family dysfunction into my relationship with Daniel. The guilt, the anxiety, the constant need to manage other people's emotions at the expense of my own. But as I healed and transformed, I became a better partner, more present and authentic and capable of real intimacy. Daniel told me one night that he felt like he was watching me become the person I was always meant to be, unburdened by the weight of other people's expectations and manipulation. We started planning for our future, talking about buying a house, maybe having kids someday. And for the first time, those conversations weren't clouded by worry about how my family would react or what Marcus would demand from us. The simple act of saying no to Marcus had created a domino effect that changed every aspect of my life. And 6 months after my wedding, I barely recognized the person I'd been before. I'd lost some family members, at least temporarily, but I'd gained something infinitely more valuable. Myself, my peace, my sense of agency and autonomy. I learned that you can love people from a distance, that you can wish someone well while refusing to be destroyed by their chaos, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their own choices instead of constantly rescuing them. My transformation wasn't about becoming cold or heartless. It was about becoming boundaried and self-aware, about understanding that I couldn't set myself on fire to keep anyone else warm, not even family. And this new version of myself was preparing for one final confrontation with Marcus that would test everything I'd learned. Almost a year after my wedding, Marcus reached out to me through a method I didn't expect. A handwritten letter delivered to my house, not an email or text or phone call. The letter was 6 pages long, and when I first saw his handwriting on the envelope, my hand started shaking and I almost threw it away without reading it. But something made me open it. What I read shocked me because for the first time in our entire relationship, Marcus took responsibility for his actions without making excuses or blaming anyone else. He wrote about hitting rock bottom after I refused to help him, about finally getting into a rehab program after he'd been arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, about starting to understand through therapy how his behavior had hurt everyone around him, especially me. He apologized for ruining my wedding, for lying about the money, for turning the family against me, and for the decades of manipulation and selfishness that had defined our relationship. He didn't ask for forgiveness, or for a relationship, or for money. He just apologized and said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again. I sat with that letter for days, reading it over and over, trying to decide if it was genuine or just another manipulation. Dr. Chen helped me understand that I might never know for sure if Marcus's change was real, and that I didn't have to decide right away what role, if any, I wanted him to have in my life going forward. What mattered most was that I'd already done the work of healing, that my peace and stability weren't dependent on Marcus changing or my family apologizing. Whether Marcus maintained his sobriety and continued his growth or fell back into old patterns, I would be okay because I'd built a life that wasn't centered around managing his chaos. I eventually wrote him back, a short letter acknowledging his apology and telling him I hoped he continued his recovery, but I didn't commit to rebuilding our relationship because trust, once broken so thoroughly, takes years to repair if it can be repaired at all. Looking back on everything that happened, the ruined wedding, the family alienation, the painful process of setting boundaries and choosing myself, I can honestly say I'm grateful for it. Not because it wasn't terrible and traumatic, because it was, but because it forced me to become the person I needed to be. I learned that betrayal, especially from family, can either destroy you or transform you depending on how you respond to it. I learned that sometimes love means walking away from people who refuse to treat you with basic respect and dignity. I learned that the opinions of people who don't have your best interests at heart don't deserve space in your head or your heart. And most importantly, I learned that choosing yourself over toxic family obligations isn't selfish. It's survival, and it's the foundation of every healthy, authentic life. If you're going through something similar right now, if you have a Marcus in your life who's manipulating you and a family that's enabling them, I want you to know that you're not crazy and you're not alone. What you're experiencing is real, the pain is valid, and you have every right to protect yourself even if it means disappointing people or being misunderstood. Setting boundaries will be one of the hardest things you ever do, and you'll probably lose some relationships in the process. But what you'll gain, your peace, your self-respect, your authentic life, is worth infinitely more than the approval of people who only value you when you're sacrificing yourself for them. It took my brother ruining my wedding and demanding money he wasn't owed for me to finally wake up and choose myself, but maybe hearing my story will help you choose yourself sooner, before you lose years of your life to people who don't deserve your loyalty. So after hearing my story, I want to ask you, what would you have done in my place? And more importantly, what are you going to do about the toxic situations in your own life? Do you believe revenge ever truly brings peace? Or is the real victory in refusing to let toxic people steal your joy anymore? If this story resonated with you, if you're ready to start your own journey of setting boundaries and choosing yourself, make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because I'll be sharing more stories about family drama, betrayal, and the courage it takes to build a life on your own terms. Drop a comment below sharing your own experience with family boundaries or toxic relationships. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own strength. I'm Amelia Martinez, and I'll see you in the next video where I'll reveal what happened when Marcus and I finally had our first conversation after a year of no contact. And trust me, you won't believe what he told me about what really happened during that time. Until then, remember, you are not responsible for managing other people's dysfunction, and choosing yourself is never the wrong choice.